Hello, I'm Paul Perrello, and welcome to the Philly Factor. Payola. In the music industry, this was a term that you didn't really want to have tagged or associated with your name. It's still perhaps out there today. Payola really tainted the industry back in the 50s and the 60s. There were many people on air, namely in radio, and perhaps behind the scenes, that were caught up in this scandal. It also led to government investigations. And some of the bigger names in Philadelphia radio and television, as well as on the national scene, got caught up into this scandal of payola. The definition of payola: a secret or private payment in return for the promotion of a product, service, etc., through the abuse of one's position, influence, or facilities. Basically, if you had the money, your music would be played on a radio station. And depending on whether you had money or not, you had a hit and a successful career. If you didn't have the money, well, if luck was on your side, maybe you had a career. If not, you sort of just withered away and faded into the backdrop. When payola first hit the collective consciousness of the country, it was back in the heyday of radio. Careers were made or broken, and we're talking about the careers again on and off radio. In The Wages of Spin, a documentary by Character Driven Productions, that documentary really sheds light on the scandal. In the history of radio and television, some of the biggest names in the industry were caught up in this scandal. Wages of Spin chronicles the Philadelphia music scene from 1952 through 1963. It documents the inner workings of the Philadelphia music industry. Joining me to discuss Wages of Spin, parts 1 and 2, is producer and director Shawn Swords. And Shawn, I want to thank you for being with us here on the program.
What's that rebuttal? My pleasure.
Okay.
I had to think of the standard
yeah,
one.
Right. In conversations that we've had previously, when I first heard about Wages of Spin and I sat down and I watched it, having worked 35 years plus in the radio industry, payola is that word that sort of sends shivers up and down everybody's spine. And it was associated with the time in radio when radio was just hitting its stride. A lot of names in the industry would tell you, never took a dollar, don't know what you're talking about, no, not me, you know, maybe him, maybe he did it, but it really caught a lot of people in the tangled web. So what caused you to sort of focus the light on payola and in particular the Philadelphia radio industry?
Well, it started out with the Charlie Gracie documentary. I was introduced to Charlie by Mike G down in North Wildwood, where Charlie had been playing for, off and on since the 50s. I was introduced to him about 15 years ago. And Mike approached me while we were working on another project down there at Moore's Inlet in New Jersey. And he said, "Are you familiar with Charlie's story?" And honestly, I just knew Charlie from the guy you saw down at Moore's Inlet on the weekends. You knew he had talent, obviously. Yep. But he was more of a showman. You didn't realize that he had a prodigious talent. He was a rock and roll pioneer, in the 50s, and the first rock and roll star to break out in Philadelphia. So he said, "Are you familiar with this story?" I said, "No." He said, "Did you know he had a #1 hit?" And that kind of caught me off guard. Sure. Because it was kind of almost like a tiki environment down there, with the elderly set and everything that Charlie was performing in. And I said, "No." So obviously I got captivated real quick by that. So he explained to me what happened. He said, "Well, on this break, why don't you talk to Charlie?" So you know Charlie, you're kind of smitten with him right away as soon as you meet him. And he's also a gifted storyteller. Yep. So we sat down for a couple of hours and he told me his story and I was just mesmerized. I was so captivated by the whole thing. So I said, we definitely need to pursue this. So we were a young company at the time. We had only had one regional documentary on UPN out. And I said, this is a story that might have national appeal. And right away people were saying, "Well, why are you going to do a story about Charlie Gracie?" And I said, "No, this man has an incredible multi-layered story, and I don't think people are aware of what he went through." So within a week we were shooting. Within a couple of weeks we're interviewing Graham Nash, people like Shelby Checker, the Dovells, Danny and the Jr., Peter Noon. I mean, he was a major influence on the Brits. And when he was a teenager going over to Britain, they were 12 and 13-year-olds, these people. So during the course of the filming with that, people had two questions, or one was an assertion, one was a question. It's a shame what, like Andy Williams, first thing he asked me is, in this kind of faux brogue, he was like, well, what is it that happened to Charlie? And I said, so sat down with Andy Williams and told him for an hour, because they had concurrently a #1 hit together. Yeah. So he went one way, and Charlie usually always says went to Wildwood. So during the course of that, I told him, what had happened with Dick Clark and, suing his record label. I kind of evolved into this, is that a lot of people, and the other response was, it's a shame what happened to Charlie, or what happened to Charlie, in the interrogative. So as we went through it, more and more people kept asking us. So one time the producer and I just looked at each other and we said, there's a story here about Dick Clark. I mean, because his name just kept coming up. He didn't pay me, he took my copyright, he took a piece of my company. Mostly people were still afraid because he was still alive and it was off camera, that they would tell you. But if you watch the documentary, a couple people did go on record and say it. And Charlie was one of the biggest catastrophes of that whole Payola thing in the early 50s, and late 50s and early 60s, is he sued to get 50% of his royalties. He was supposed to get, wait, let me get this whole story straight. It was Charlie sued to get his royalties from Butterfly.
Right.
And what happened was, because he sued his label, Cameo Parkway, Dick Clark owned 50% of that song under the table and blacklisted Charlie. The word was, I got this from the horse's mouth, that was put out throughout the country, that Dick said, you better not play the record, do not play the record. And it ruined Charlie's career. So that made us want to dig deeper.
Yeah.
So we started interviewing artists after artists after artists from that time frame, and they all said the same thing. We had to sign the checks back over. We had to give them publishing rights. We had to give them pieces of our companies if you were a producer or a record label owner. So it just kind of took a life into its own, and kind of 18 months of filming went by like, that.
We had interviewed Charlie when his book came out, and he recounts with a vivid recollection about what happened and how he was basically blackballed from the music industry because all he wanted was what was rightfully his. And when he asked for his money, he just sort of disappeared. He was still big, maybe overseas, but he just, his music wasn't being played on Philadelphia radio stations. And in the documentary, Artie Singer tells the story of his record with Danny and the Juniors at the Hop. And he says that word got back to him that in order for At the Hop to be played on Bandstand, Dick Clark was asking for X amount of dollars. If not, the music would never get played, and there would be no At the Hop hit, which people are still dancing to today, and perhaps there would be no Danny and the Juniors today, because that, what we've come to know as Payola, if the artist or the record promoter wasn't willing to pony up the money, then that song never would see the light of day.
Okay, there's definitive proof that how this works. 16 Candles came out. It was given 2 or 3 spins on American Bandstand. After, it went nowhere, so they dropped it. It wasn't selling any records in any stores. So Dick Clark gets assigned a copyright for 16 Candles. This is how it would work. He would show you his power. I'll play it a couple times. It doesn't jump off the charts or get placed on the charts. I'm going to show you what it'll do if I do, and I lean on it. He leans on it, just plays it every day, week in, week out. Ends up #2 song that entire year and a rock classic. Who would have known about it if it wouldn't have been out? It was that powerful a marketing tool, American Bandstand, that you had to basically come through him to get a success. I mean, it could be in the grooves. There were certain songs that could be played regionally and maybe pop here and there, like they used to have to do, go from specific major markets and play it, and then it would work its way down to smaller markets. But with this, you had one-stop shopping. You could play it on American Bandstand and lean on it for a week or 2, and it would definitely sell more records than it would have, and it would probably be a hit if he leaned on it that much. So he knew he was the gatekeeper, for all of this.
And we should mention that at the time, the Bandstand was on every day. It wasn't just a once-a-week show. When Bandstand first went on the air, it was on Monday through Friday on Channel 6 here in Philadelphia. So, and then it will go national because, as history tells us, the show started out locally and then would have a national audience join, afterwards. And so he was a not only local figure but a national figure.
Oh yeah, it was a good analogy is American Idol 5 days a week.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it was that powerful because all that demographic, all that kids, I don't know, 90% of them or more were tuned into American Bandstand. And so, you don't know who, obviously he set his emissaries or his underlings to people to demand certain things. I want a copyright, I want a piece of your merchandising, I want a piece of your artist. He went into every aspect of the recording industry. The recording, the artist, the representation, dolls that they sell, merchandising, everything. So the word got around if you came to Dick and you gave him something that you could get on there. Payola was basically, in its more elemental form, anything of value in exchange for airplay. Yeah. So I mean, people were giving him money, copyrights, fur coats, trips to wherever they went back then, Aruba. Yeah. So I mean, he got very wealthy in a very short period of time.
But he wasn't the only one doing it either. I'm sure there were other people, and there were many disc jockeys in Philadelphia that would tell you that, as I said at the beginning, that they didn't get caught up in the scandal, but they knew that record promoters would come to the radio station and pay someone or give someone money in order to get their record played, not just once or twice, but numerous times throughout the week. But it was never that disc jockey. It was always someone else that was getting the money.
Oh yeah, I mean, everybody was doing it. It was systemic throughout the whole, if it was top 40 or pop, whatever, there's terms that have evolved over the years, but they all did it. A couple of them had to leave, some of the higher profile guys. Have you seen it? High Lit, Joe Niagara, all these guys were involved in it because there really wasn't anything stopping them from doing it. There was no Payola legislation enacted at that point. That happened with the congressional hearings after the Clark debacle. So all of these people did it, but it was $50 handshake, the famous term, or put the $50 in the record. But also, Bob Horn, remember, was the precursor to Dick Clark. He just had Bandstand locally, but a lot of the methods that he employed, Clark utilized just on a bigger scale. Remember, Clark was just in Philadelphia for, I believe, a year. Then he went national. But it was a turnkey operation. He took all of these what do they call? I don't know that malfeasance, and he just took it to a national level. So, but it was these things where you give money, you give copyrights. They were kind of on a regional or a provincial level. And then with Clark, he just took it to another level. And because it was television and because it was national, it just exponentially made him wealthier, and the prices to get on the show exponentially higher too. But it's been in place since there was DJs.
And yet there was a congressional investigation, and he, as well as so many other people, sort of managed to exit the hearings and the scandal pretty much unscathed. And then, it was like the government, clamped down on this practice. And yet today, some people would say that Payola, or Plugola, as it's also referred to, is still going on today. Maybe not as obvious as it was back in the beginning, but it's still a practice that takes place in this industry.
Yeah, it was curtailed. It just happened differently after the process was changed. After the congressional hearings in, I think it was 60, the process changed from the program directors taking charge of programming the music that was going to be on the air. Before that, it was the disc jockeys. So instead of coming to the disc jockeys, you went to the program directors. And it was the same processes that were, they became a little bit more clever, hiding it differently, expensing it differently, being a little bit more covert. You're not going to sign a piece of a publishing company or a recording company after that, but you were still going to give cash or call it something else, promotional expenses. But with Clark, it became, after Clark's, not demise because he went on for years, but after that policy or that procedure had ended, then it was just back to regional payoffs with everybody. And then there were some other shows that came that way, but they became more clever in the way that they hid the money, the exchanges, the transactions. But you got to remember, our expertise, or the field, the epochs that we basically observed, were the 50s and 60s, and then the 80s and 70s. So it was just done differently. Independent promotion men came around like in the 70s, you know, in the 80s, and they did not work for record labels. Before that, they had all worked for the record labels. So there was a little bit more accountability there. With the introduction of the independent promo men, there was a buffer of deniability there. Okay, well, we paid this guy to go promote the records. We don't know what he did with the money after that. So these guys became so powerful in the 70s and 80s, you know, the promo men, that, and the record labels became stronger. Like any other industry, they were growing. They were branching off into other industries and had more resources available to them. But it's still there. I mean, it's always been there, but it was in its heyday probably in the 70s and the 80s with the independent promoters, because like I said, you could lose your FCC license if you got caught after 60 with the Payola. So you definitely had to have those buffers, those independent promotion men who would just go and pay, and it got really evolved with that. You know, kickbacks from executives in the companies, drugs, you know, trips everywhere. Just more deniability because you had a buffer in between your record label and the DJ.
If you want to know more about Wages of Spin, as well as Wages of Spin 2, you could go to the website, characterdrivenproductions.com, and you can find more information out, not only about those two documentaries, but many other projects that Shawn and his company is involved with and in. And in the few minutes that we have here, you're wearing a hat that says Duffer's Cut, because this is another project that Shawn is involved in. And if you've been looking at the newspapers recently, especially over the past few months, you'll know that there's been this excavation that's been underway out in the suburbs. And so just give us a little bit of a tease about what Duffy's Cut is all about.
Well, Duffy's Cut, well, it's on television on Channel 35. It's been on for a week, and it's going to be on Saturday and Sunday. We'll put it on 3 or 4 other local channels, probably public television, maybe Fox 29. And then we're going to put it to probably national PBS. You know, that's where our last 3 projects, Wages of Spin 2, and Charlie Gracie Fabulous are at. So we'll probably go there with that. But there was an incident in 1832 where a railroad crew of Irish railroad workers died of cholera and were murdered because they had cholera. So Bill and Frank Watson, professor at Immaculata and a reverend, twin brothers, have been working on this excavation since 2004. And they've excavated 7 bodies. There's 50 bodies that are still remaining there, but are getting ready to start the second phase to get the remains of the other 50 bodies out of there. That's about to start. They have to prove it first with the DNA, and that's going to happen within a couple weeks, the excavating the DNA from the ground. And once they prove that it's there, they're going to go in to dig. It's already set up. It's going to happen to get the other 50 bodies. And then there's 2 more sites, mass graves in Downingtown and Spring City of Irish Canal and railroad workers. So it looks like a systemic pattern up the railroad and then over to Spring City, where anybody who was getting cholera, they were just murdering these crews. But these guys have been really diligent. They started out with a couple of college kids, you know, I don't even want to give the story away, it's so amazing. You can see it on Channel 35, or you can go to IrishAmericanFilms.com. All the information's there. And how long the duration of this project's been, about 14 years.
Wow.
But they found the people. I mean, it's important to get these guys, you know, there's women there too. There's 2 women that were on the crew, to get them buried properly, you know, to get them out of that, you know, where they're at, that landfill, and get them, you know, buried in consecrated ground, or at least, you know, get them back to their families. A couple of the bodies have already been taken back to Ireland.
Wow.
You know, that were exhumed and buried properly. So it's real exciting at this point that you have the other 50, you know, getting ready to go and get the remains of the other 50 bodies. And it's received extensive national media coverage.
Yeah, it's a story that otherwise we would not hear here in our area, but you know, the fact that these 2 researchers have been pretty much diligently working to not only exhume the bodies, but to sort of document everything along the way. How did they then enlist character-driven productions then to, you talked about having a informal conversation with Charlie Gracie, and that led to that project, which then led to Wages to Spin. So how did you then get involved, your company get involved in making a documentary about their work?
Well, we were working with Irish Television for a year and a half, and we were going to produce a series on the Irish history in Philadelphia. So the pilot was going to be the railroad episode, but they went under. Irish Television went under about a year ago, and we had all this footage from the railroad, and we had met Bill Watson. So with that, we said, there's a great story here, and there's 8 years of narrative missing, and there's 2 other mass grave sites to explore. So it had been documented on national television with Secrets of the Dead and a program over in Ireland, but they were missing a lot of the narrative. It was kind of focused on forensics. So we said, there's a story here, the people, how they got here, the trajectory of how they went from, Donegal, places that they were leaving in Ireland, to being in the ground. They were literally all dead within, I think, 3 to 4 weeks after they got here. So, I said, this is a great story, but it has to be comprehensive. It has to be layered. It can't just be, okay, we found this skull, now we're going to prove it.
Right.
There's a story to each and every one of these people, and there was a story of how this whole travesty, this injustice was depicted, so we needed to explore it more. So we just decided to do that, because we had already been working on a project about the series of the Irish in Philadelphia and one about the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Philadelphia. We said, this one's so important because we need to get this dig started. And at the time, it wasn't confirmed that the dig was going to be able to start again. But now that it has, the film's come out, there's been so much exposure the last couple of months that this has been great. So it's going to start again. So our primary initiative was to make sure that this project got back on its feet and that it started again to get those other 50 remains, and now it's happening.
Yeah. What made you decide, Shawn, that you wanted to work in documentary films?
I was out in LA when 9/11 happened, and the studio shut down. I was going to get a producing job. So we came back to Philadelphia, and the XL1 camera had, come on the scene. So somebody showed me some footage that they did with an XL1, and I said, wow, this almost looks like regular film.
Yeah.
The frame speed's obviously different, and it looks more like film. It's something that you could project, it looks like on television, or at least for a documentary, and conform it. And I said, went down the shore, we were looking for a subject matter for the first one, because nobody knew who we were at the time. And we saw Blackthorn perform. We had a tent down in Wyoming. There's 3,000 people there for 10 shows. I was like, well, I think we have our first local story here.
Yeah.
So we followed them around for a year, and it gave us practice working with multiple crews, camera guys, higher angles, different angles. But we were all looking for careers in narrative filmmaking, straightforward features. But because of the Blackthorn piece, it was so exciting working on it and being involved, and it's a little bit more rigorous, kind of shooting concerts and all that. It was a real pleasant experience. So at the end of that is when the Charlie Gracie story came to us. And we've always been about telling great stories, if you look at it. And after Blackthorn, it was all injustices. Charlie Gracie, would happen to him. Dick Clark and all of those artists would happen to them. Wages to Spin 2, the DOJ investigation and MCA Music getting circumvented, and now we have a Wages to Spin 3 that should be ready, and within a year, as soon as the Irish projects are all done.
Yeah.
But documentaries, and they're cheaper. The risk, one bad film, it can ruin your career.
Yeah.
But we've had three straight projects distributed nationally, so it's kind of working, the documentaries.
You mentioned, and I think it's so important to know that, everybody thinks that they have the next great story, but you said, that, finding these stories sometimes may be obvious right there in front of you, and then maybe sometimes not so obvious. But when you look for a story, what compels you to say, we're going to invest our time and effort into this project?
Well, first of all, like I said, this wasn't by design initially, but it's kind of evolved there. It has to be about something substantive. We don't do anything tawdry or salacious. We never went into any of our subject matters personal lives, any proclivities they might have had, or anything salacious. We stayed away from all that, but it is about people abusing their position that affects everybody that they abuse. So that's one of the criteria, but we kind of got away from that after the Duffy's Cut thing with the history of Philadelphia and the St. Patrick. You need a little levity.
Sure, yeah.
You know, you're with this really, and you know, we make films about very powerful people. It's caused us a few problems here and there, you know, threats that you get, and there was kind of cost us a major representation in Hollywood. You know, we had that all lined up, and then twice, and 2 films kind of, you know, stopped that. So with the documentaries that we produce, we have enough of a pedigree that we can get them distributed. But then, you know, like anything else, it's getting paid the royalties and everything at the back end. So you have to try to get everything you can when you're licensing. But, you know, we're going to stick with the documentaries for a while.
Well, you do that. It's a great job with Wages of Spin 1 and 2. In a few weeks, we're going to have Shawn back with some of the representatives of Duffy's Cut to learn more about that story in an upcoming edition of the Philly Factor. So I want to thank Shawn for being with us here to discuss his work now. He'll be back with us in a few weeks. And until the next time, I want to say thanks for watching the Philly Factor. My name is Paul Perrello. You have a great day. And we sit there and do this.